So can I just start off by issuing a disclaimer? I'm not an expert on homelessness, and don't claim to be. Although I'm an academic now, before I moved into academia, then I was a social worker and manager in the city in Glasgow and in another in South Lanarkshire, and did various other bits and pieces around that before I moved into university. So currently, my primary role is as an educator. I teach social work students on both undergraduate and master's programs, as well as running an advanced award for chief social work officers. And I tend to teach on adult social care generally, amongst other things. So SDS, adult support and protection, the general community care legislation is something that is my kind of primary teaching interest. I have a kind of side interest, if you like, in self-directed support from a research angle. So I did a bit of work for Coalition of Care Providers Scotland, the umbrella organisation for the third sector, which many of you will be familiar with, back in 2015 on option 2. I have the privilege of supervising a PhD student, Felicity Morrow, who is looking at an ethnographic study of self-directed support in a local authority, and I'll touch on some of her data, but it's fascinating work that she is doing. We co-authored an insight for IRIS, the IRIS Institute for Research and Innovation in Social Services, sorry for all the acronyms, on self-directed support, which is the kind of brief evidence summary of what we of where we have got to with SDS 10 years on. And I also recently undertook a literature review for the Equality and Human Rights Commission on self-directed support and equalities in all of that. And it's interesting when we're looking at equalities and we're looking at protected characteristics. Obviously, living with homelessness isn't counted as a protected characteristic, and that might be something that people want to talk about later. And I'm also a member of the SDS steering group that Ailsa and colleagues have been involved in. So I kind of been around this stuff for around this area for quite a long time now, but coming to it relatively fresh, I think. So what I would like to do in the time allotted to me is to talk a little bit about what SDS is and indeed what it isn't. I think it's important that we have, that for some of you who are terribly familiar with SDS, this might be it might be old ground, but I think it's important that we establish when we're talking about SDS what it is and what it isn't. A little bit about the journey so far, and to ask that time-honored question, are we there yet? And I think, with a spoiler alert, the answer is not quite. I'm going to talk a little bit about the development of the standards, and Ailsa, I'm sure we'll talk more about that later, to touch on what limited evidence, published evidence there is on SDS and homelessness. And again, the short answer is not very much. And to offer some thoughts for the future direction of self-directed support. So that's what I hope to do in the time that's available, and if we're possibly have time for a couple of questions at the end. So that's the plan. So the first thing to say is what SDS is, right? And this might sound like a rather strange thing to say, but it's the law. Right, so it places duties on local authorities, and it's important to stress that at the outset. So that there's still a discourse that says we're not going down the SDS route, right? We're not, we are not doing that at this point. In reality, in legal terms, the local authority does not have an option. If something's a duty, it's something that the local authority has to do. And the duties are enshrined in the Self-Directed Support Act, which was passed in 2013 and enacted in 2014, and supported by practitioner guidance. Right, so there's a whole legal platform for this that says this is what local authorities should be doing, must be doing in all of that. And enshrined in that legislation and in the guidance are three key principles. One, the involvement of the supported person, right, in the process. Two, the assistance provided for the supported person to help them negotiate the complexities of the process. And thirdly, collaboration with the supported person. Okay, so that's what those key principles are enshrined in the legislation. And say what it isn't optional for local authorities. And I think it's important to acknowledge that at this point. Okay, so when we're talking about the duties on the local authority, I'm just going to briefly and say some of you will be familiar with this, right? And the local authority has a duty to offer 4 options to the supported person, right? My emphasis on duty. Firstly, the option of a direct payment, right? And the direct payment is where the person, the supported person, takes responsibility for the overall budget for which they are allocated. Right, that option of direct payments has been around for a long time. Option 3, arranging services by the local authority. That option has been around for a long time as well. Local authority provides the service. That's as simple as and how it is, and that option has been around for quite a long time as well. What has been new and controversial, and I think we're still not quite there yet in terms of this, is option 2, right? Whereby the person whereby the person directs the available support, supported person directs the available support, but doesn't have responsibility for managing the budget. That is sometimes done through individual service funds, where an agency will take on the responsibility of organising the support. There's a limited evidence base around option 2, but this is a considerable innovation in terms of social work and support in Scotland, and I think that it remains to be that the potential of option 2 is yet unfulfilled. Would be my personal opinion in all of that. And then option 4, which is a mix of the first 3 options, where you could have some of this and some of that. So those 4 options are enshrined in legislation. So the local authority has the duty to offer those 4 options off the top. Okay. There's a duty to explain the nature and effect of the 4 options. So it's not just, well, you wouldn't really want option 2, would you? Because it's a bit complicated, right? It's about the duty to explain the nature and the effect of the options, and also a duty to provide information about advocacy. So the legislation places very clear duties on the local authority in terms of the way support should be offered. Okay, I think it's important to stress that at the outset, particularly when we come into some of the discussion further down the road. Okay. Okay, now answering the question then, are we there yet? Okay, sorry, my computer thing. So the question, are we there yet? Right, the evidence from not just from research, but from scrutiny activity undertaken by Audit Scotland and by the Care Inspectorate in their thematic inspection just as recently as 2019, is we're not there yet. And I think there's a number of reasons for that. Right? One is there's a limit to the extent to which people have choice and control over the support that they receive. The rhetoric is about choice and control. The reality, when you drill down and look at it and on the ground, is that there's a limit to the extent to which people have choice and control. Processes and procedures have become bureaucratic. Right, the intention, the values, the aims and objectives of self-directed support, the way that I describe it bumped up against local authority processes and procedures which are not flexible and innovative enough to deal with the implications of self-directed support. So we end up with an incredibly bureaucratic process for something that is designed to be straightforward and easy to access. And I've heard a number of stories of support being being sought but not being provided because the local authority processing procedures weren't able to accommodate it, kind of, and that's not helpful. Now, that also relates to the fact there's a lack of transparency and recording, and quite often, if you look at the care inspectorate report, quite often decisions about people's self-directed support packages are made when they're not even in the room, right? And I think that lack of transparency and recording is a real issue in all of that. And a number of places, for good reason, geography, limited providers, etc., there's a lack of true availability of all the 4 options. And the level of co-production, the intention should be is that self-directed support is co-produced in all of that. Yeah, and lastly, there's the issue of there's an inconsistent knowledge across the workforce. Okay, right, and I'm picking up in the chat from Susan McGregor, and thank you for pointing that out, Susan. Yeah, there is the issue about eligibility and in all of that, and that the requirement is for people to be eligible for support, and often people will be signposted out actually of provision. Thank you for making that point. Right. Now, of course, all this has been done against the backdrop of a sustained period of austerity, right? And I think it's important, we sometimes, because we've been living with austerity for so long, right, that we've kind of just got used to it, we've accommodated it, if you like. And certainly in some local authorities, self-directed support has been used as a kind of as a mechanism to introduce savings and economies in all of that. Call it what you will. And there's a suggestion actually that this is the right policy. This has been the right policy at the wrong time. In that the aims and objectives of ESTI were absolutely laudable, but we introduced them at the time when austerity was in full flow. We need to acknowledge that social care spending has fallen in real terms, and then of course if we didn't, it wasn't bad enough that we had austerity. We then had the impact of the pandemic, and what we know, what the evidence, the early evidence is, of course, is that the impact of the pandemic falls on unevenly and falls most heavily on those in need, and that's important. And of course, what gets trotted out is this the notion of there is no magic money tree, to use that kind of rather patronizing cliche in all of that. And I found this image of the magic money tree from a blog for someone, a carer with attitude, which is a wonderful blog, which says, "Don't pat me on the head because I might bite." So I think that's a blog with attitude that I found that I came across when I was preparing for this presentation. So I think it's important to acknowledge that what is being done is being done against a backdrop of austerity and the impact of the pandemic. So if it wasn't hard enough before, then it's even harder now. So, and Ailsa, I'm sure we'll talk more about that. And I think there's been a recognition, really, and apologies for the complexities of some of this, but I'll talk you through it. And this is that one of the solutions to this has been the development of the self-directed support standards, which were published in March earlier this year. Right. Now, that has been done against the backdrop of the SDS change map, which government produced, and of course the other bit we are now, and I'm not sure how much this has come up in terms of the conference, is the independent review of adult social care, the feeling review, and the work that's being done, the consultation that's going on at the moment around the development of the National Care Service and what that might mean in all of that. So the self-directed support standards, I think, provide in the middle of all of this complex agenda, the SDS standards provide a way through this, at least in the short to medium term. And having been involved, I think the Social Work Scotland team that led on this has been a wide involvement of stakeholders around around that, some of whom may well be in the room this morning. And Scottish Government published a learning review from that, and all of these references are at the end. So the SDS standards, I think, they provide an opportunity, I think, to take some of this forward, even whilst all the discussion is going on around the National Care Service. So, just very briefly, I'm not going to go into these in too much detail. I don't have time to do that, unfortunately. But there's 11 standards, with the 12th being developed, and those standards include things like the right to independent support and advocacy, the adoption of a strength and asset-based approach to work with supported people, worker autonomy, and that's the one that I will focus on a little bit more in just a little bit minute. Yeah. Okay. Transparency around the process. About I'm trying to follow the chat as well, which is quite complicated, but the transparency about the process and consistency about practice. Yeah, absolutely. So that because there's very clear indications that there are significant differences between local authorities and indeed even within the local authorities in that. Yeah. And as I'm picking up some stuff in the chat that I'll maybe come back to just at the end, rather than kind of dot in and out. Social Work Scotland are supporting this support to local authorities. They're doing further work around resources and access to budgets, but it provides an option. It provides a significant and concrete way of taking the development and work around SDS standards. Yeah. Okay. Right. Yeah. I think the comments in the chat I will pick up in just a minute, because I'm not disagreeing with anything that Patrick and Faith have saying just now, but the SDS standards are there. Okay. So one of the key standards, and one that is being focused on, I think, because it is important in all of this, is the standard 8, which is about worker autonomy. So that is about the social workers being allowed to exercise the professional autonomy in the support planning. Within, obviously, there needs to be parameters, there needs to be limits on all of this, but the opportunity for workers to exercise professional autonomy is really, really important. Okay. And that workers feel, in all of that, just to highlight a couple of phrases there, that the organisation allows workers to feel trusted and confident and resilient in all of that, so that the workers are allowed to do the job that they were trained to do, and as someone whose primary job is in social work education, that social workers, that they have the skills and abilities and confidence to be able to do that. But in all of that, there is a range that workers are allowed to be creative. What is the data that I have seen, both my own data and the data of others, and talking to people around that, is that if workers are allowed to be creative in the use of the range of supports, then they will do that. They will use their creativity to provide support in a way that meets people's needs. The problem too often, not exclusively, but the problem too often, is that workers' autonomy is constrained by bureaucratic systems. Okay, so that So I focus on standard 8 because I think it's one that the Social Work Scotland team have identified as important, and to be encouraged, and to look at how that worker autonomy can be developed. Okay, moving on, and and it's around, and I think been alluded to, I think in some of the comments in the chat, is that, and this is a lot of this is to do with the work that Felicity's doing, is that practitioners are often required to talk multiple languages in terms of risk and trust. Right, so the question about whose risk is it to take, whose risk is it to take? Is it the risk of the supported person? Is it the risk to the local authority? And the complexities of all of this. And if you've not come across it, I would encourage you to look at the work of Alison Faulkner, who writes from the perspective both of as a researcher and someone who has received support because of her own care needs, and she writes very eloquently about her own experiences of support, and says that at points that she should not have been allowed to take the risk that she was subsequently allowed to take. And I think what Alison's work provides is a real insight into the complexities of support in this area. Right? But what the Care Inspectorate inspection found, and was reinforced by Felicity's work, right, is that practitioners are often asked to talk two different languages. Right, so when they're talking to the supported person, they're talking the language of strengths. You're able to do this, you're able to do that, but when they then need to do a pivot and talk to the organisation to justify the support that is required, they then are required to talk the language of deficits. And that workers are they're asked to kind of almost face two ways. And I think that's incredibly important, to acknowledge that the complexities of the system are that they build that in. Okay, so that's again expand on that, but I think just to flag that up at this point. Now, what's the evidence? The published SDS evidence on SDS and homelessness didn't take. Now there may be stuff out there that I've missed, but I had a pretty good look, and I couldn't find very much. Right, what I could find was the SDS and homelessness work that Simon Community did back in 2015. Right, and they identified back in 2015 that there was low levels of awareness of SDS across the sector. Right, they identified low levels of choice, and that there were structural issues about the lack of flexibility and the work needed to educate the staff on the statutory role. So the Simon Community, and I know that there was work that followed on from that, but I wasn't able to find published work on that. And I think that you might think, okay, that was 2015. So surely things have moved on by now. Well, unfortunately, I think that's not the case, right? So what happened was that the Health and Social Care Alliance and Self-Directed Support Scotland produced in autumn of last year the My Support, My Choice research, which was, they interviewed over 600 people across Scotland who received self-directed support, and they offered 67 recommendations in all of that, but they were talking to people who were in receipt of SDS, right, and they identified that there were difficulties in gaining access to support. Okay, now within that 120 page report, there's some reference to homelessness, and I'll talk more about that in just a minute. But worryingly, the social work staff respect for people, supported people wasn't always there. The consistency and transparency issue was reinforced by this, and that they were stressing the importance of advocacy and and independent advice, and they suggested that the support and training should be targeted to specific groups, including those working in homelessness. Okay. Now, homelessness does get a mention in self-direct in this report, but it's very, very brief, I have to say, right? And it probably it would not be terribly unfamiliar to people in the room, I'm sure. Service providers weren't talking to each other. Right? The stigma of faced by many people experiencing homelessness, and that disconnect meant that people were required to revisit trauma that they'd undergone. Okay, and as one supported person said, you get sick of telling your story all the time. Now, there's also instances of SDS being not available for people who are homeless. It's too complex to administer. Now, I have to remind you, as I said earlier on, that SDS is a duty. So really, this is too complex to administer is really not a defense in all of this, because it's a duty on the local authority. Okay, just as I come to the end of my time in all of that, the future of self-directed support is uncertain, I think, in the face of the independent review of adult social care and the National Care Service in all of that. But there's a recognition that there needs to be a culture shift in all of that. And that at the core of this is the adoption of a human rights-based approach to support planning and review processes. And I think that's, for me, that's core in all of that. And that there's a need to align the systems and the processes to SDS values and principles. They're very good. The systems don't always fit that. And I think I would argue that there's untapped potential of SDS with regard to the issue of homelessness. Okay, so that's a very quick canter through, right, in all of that. Thank you for listening. I think that there's a conversation to be had about where SDS and homelessness fits in all of that. Those are my details, both my email address and my Twitter handle, although I've not been active on Twitter very much recently. I think I've some social media fatigue in all of that, but thank you for listening, and all of the references are there should you require them.